All
Yeah.
right. Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you here virtually to the Hillside Club. My name is Arlene Baxter. It is my honor to be the first vice president of the Hillside Club. I'm here at the club, unfortunately by myself this evening, but at least you get to see the beautiful fireside behind me for which this lecture series has been named. This series has been going on for over a century, featuring speakers from the community and from the club sometimes, as is our honor this evening. We are here, our club is in North Berkeley, on the lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, and we honor their stewardship and their ancestors in maintaining this beautiful land. The founders of the club were a group of women who in fact wanted to maintain the beauty and the attributes of this land. They fought to maintain the rocky outcroppings and the beautiful trees. If you are interested in the early history of the club and its tenets, which was to keep the North Berkeley Hills from becoming a grid like what had happened to San Francisco, I recommend a pamphlet called The Simple Home that was published by the Hillside Club by Charles Keeler, its first president. I'm here in this beautiful building now by myself because we are still under the aegis of the pandemic, though we are hoping that soon we will be able to welcome you back into this beautiful 1924 building designed by John White with assistance from the original architect, Bernard Maybeck. So with that as the background, the women who founded this club, we would now call them environmentalists. That term didn't exist at the time, but their concerns and their desire to maintain the beauty of this earth is very consistent with what we are trying to do now. I think they would be very proud that our club has an array of solar panels and that we now would call them environmentalists and try to be that ourselves. So it's very fitting that we're welcoming this evening not only someone who is passionate about solar, but also a member of our Hillside Club. I had the pleasure of first meeting Doug when he was a speaker for me for a solar symposium that I hosted in 2016. He was then a member of the NorCal Solar Board, a position that he held for 2 terms. He has a long-standing experience in the solar industry. He has worked for Hewlett-Packard for a couple of decades, and the last decade, in fact, as a solar consultant. He's very passionate about these issues. And we have agreed that he would show his passion, but perhaps in a more balanced way than he might if he's talking to you privately. So with that, it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome Doug McKenzie to talk about our solar industry under attack and what we can do about it. Thank you, Doug.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for looking at the Hillside Club's fireplace, even if it's kind of in a virtual abstract way. And thank you, Arlene and Eric, for having me present this talk. I am passionate about it, but I also, I know enough philosophy to know the difference between a passionately held idea and a solidly evidentiary idea. And so I'll make a distinction when I'm voicing an opinion. But on the other hand, it's very important. And so we don't want to fall back into both sides of it where everything is balanced. So I'll certainly present the facts as I see them, and I might opine here and there. So with that, let's see what we got. So the talk will be those 2 bits. One of them is what's happening with solar in California now, because there's quite a lot happening. And then what might we consider doing about that? So those 2 folks, they're obviously considering both of those things. So, but first, what is this solar thing? So I'll just be really quick about this. When I used to teach solar, I would spend a lot of time on this and following things. But basically those black things up on the roof are solar panels, and they generate electricity, and they do that um, like that, so that the electricity that comes from the panels goes into that box on the right where it's got DC above it. That's called the inverter. And the inverter changes it from DC electricity to AC. And then the AC goes over to your meter box. And from there, it goes either into your house to service the electrical loads that you have, or it goes out to the grid. So I'll leave it at that, except to say that take a look at that telephone pole thing, and there's some wires coming in to your house from the grid and some arrows going out from your solar to the grid. So that'll sort of be important as we go on. And I guess regarding questions, I'll have a little space a little bit later to have questions, but I think the way to do it is via chat. And thankfully, Arlene is handling that. And so she'll take the questions that you offer through chat, and then we'll get to those at the right time or whenever she feels it's a good time to interrupt. So just really quickly, what's happening on the roof in California is the graph on the left shows the capacity. That's basically by county. So the dark blue means down San Diego County, they have a lot more solar than anywhere else because it's sunnier down there. And then the graph on the right is just to show that we have sort of an exponential curve of solar adoption, that there was basically nothing until the early 2000s. And then now there's a huge amount, where I won't go into what megawatts are and so on, but you can just see that it's sort of an exponential growth. And we have a 1.3 million solar rooftops. Governor Arnold back in the day voiced that as a vision. And then we achieved, I think it was in 2019, we got to 1 million. And so we're keeping going. So that's actually a lot. I'm not sure how many households there are in California, but probably on the order of 10 million or so. So that's a lot. Good for us. Okay, well then what's changing now? And the graph before, you can see the link up there where the circle says NEM. And that graph before was from that page. And so what in the world is NEM? And NEM means net energy metering. And you'll also hear net metering, which means the same thing. And as with everything with solar, the technology is elegant and simple and beautiful and wonderful, but all the policies and the paperwork and stuff are just enormously complicated. So to distill it down to one line, net metering is how PG&E pays you for the energy you send to the grid. So remember back in that picture where the lines coming in from the grid, and then there were the arrows going out to the grid. So when electricity comes in from the grid, you pay for that. And how much you pay for it is ridiculously complicated, but you certainly do because you get the PG&E bill. And then if you have solar on your roof, then you send electricity out to the grid. And how much do they pay you for it? And it's very complicated. But the basic thrust of it was the net energy metering from the beginning until 2016 December. They paid you just about what you would pay them. So they charge you 25 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity, and then they would pay you about 25 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity sent to them. So about kind of equal and balanced there. Then they changed from NEM 1 to NEM 2 in December 2016, and it was about the same. It's all kinds of complexities there, but it's kind of about the same, maybe 5% or 10% less good an economic investment. So where NEM 1 was quite good, NEM 2 was pretty good. And so the combination of NEM 1 and NEM, just the dates that happened from those early 2000s until now, we're currently under the NEM 2 protocol. Till now, that's what took California to tremendous rooftop solar leadership. That graph on the right that shows that exponential curve of adoption, that's because we had net metering policies that favored solar. So now we know that we're going to shift to NEM 3, and that's what most of the rest of this talk is about. And that's going to happen pretty soon. And until just a few days ago, we thought it would be happening. We thought the decision would be made as to exactly what it consisted of in January, last month, for an implementation in May. But lots of things happened. It was quite controversial. And so that decision has now been delayed. So that's what those question marks are for. So it'll still be coming. We have some hints about it, but I want to, the rest of the talk will be, well, what's going on? What are the details about that? And also why it's delayed and so on. So onward. So the NEM3 CPUC proposed decision, CPUC is the California Public Utilities Commission, and they're the regulator for PG&E and lots else, but for PG&E electricity. And they decide how much PG&E gets paid for when you draw electricity from the grid, and they decide how much PG&E pays you when you send your solar out to the grid. So they issued a proposed decision in December that was based on these inputs from all these different groups and quite a few more actually. So I list them there, and down the fine print down there is to spell out those acronyms and initialisms that are there. But lots and lots and lots of groups said, hey, do it our way, don't do it their way. And there was a tremendous amount of argumentation prior to the proposed decision. And then the CPUC brought out this proposed decision. So I'll go through a little bit of these things. So what they say, and this is still all in the straight factuals. I haven't offered opinions yet, really. So just straight factually, they wanted to modernize net metering to incentivize customers to install storage with solar. Now, what does that mean? Well, it turns out that 20 years ago, there's almost no solar. And so the peak demand was in the early afternoon for electricity throughout the state. But now there's a whole lot of solar. So that's all good news. But there's so much solar that in the early afternoon, there's a tremendous amount of electricity being generated from solar throughout the state. And there's way more than people want to use then. And so the peak demand now is pushed way out into the later part of the day. So what does that mean? Well, the sun goes down in the later part of the day. And so at the same time as this tremendous amount of solar is decreasing its output, which it does every night, that's when the demand is ramping up rapidly. And so what the CPUC wants to do is they want to say, here's some money, go get batteries with your solar. And what happens is the solar, instead of just kind of floating off and not knowing where to go, it goes into batteries. And then when the sun goes down at night, then those batteries push that energy out and everybody's happy. So that's a pretty good idea. Second item is just they're changing the name because it's not really net metering anymore for complicated reasons. They're going to be calling it net billing tariff, and you don't have to remember that or anything. Part of the decision was low-income customers, we'll get into this more a little later, but low-income customers have not been buying much solar because they don't have enough money to do it. That's been changing recently. So about half of the solar that goes in is non-affluent people, as they say. But the CPUC legitimately wanted to make it easier for low-income customers to go solar. That's what they say, and that's what they're trying to do. One of the things that they're doing that may or may not accomplish that is a grid access charge of $8 a kilowatt. And to put that in context, the average system in Berkeley and perhaps California is around 5 kilowatts. So a little bit larger outside in the rest of California, but 5 kilowatts in Berkeley. So that means that this proposed decision would charge 8 times 5 or $40 a month for the privilege of having solar. And if you do a little bit of math about that, if you think $8 times 5 kilowatts is $40 a month, is $480 a year, and then it's the lifetime of the solar system is about 25 years, and so they're going to be charging you about $12,000 for that. And the cost of a system, about 5 kilowatt system, is a little under $12,000 with some other math that I'll kind of skip. But basically what this grid access charge means is over the life of the system, PG&E is going to charge you more just for owning solar than it cost you to put it on. Enormous charge. And nobody doubts that. PG&E will say this is why it has to be so enormous, but they don't discount that it is enormous. And when I say PG&E and the CPUC, they're different entities, but there's a little bit of regulatory captures, they say, and so the CPUC followed most of what the PG&E suggested to do. So CPUC says grid access charge of $8. That's what we want. Then when it says shift compensation, remember those 2 wires coming in from the grid going out to the grid? It used to be that NEM1 and NEM2, they'd pay you about what you paid them. 25 cents a kilowatt hour, you pay them for grid access, for grid electricity. 25 cents a kilowatt hour, they pay you, same thing. but they're now shifting that. They want to drop that from about 25 cents down to about 5 cents kilowatt hour. So it's basically about an 80% reduction in the money that they pay you for shipping your solar energy out to the grid. Quite complicated, but that's the best guess that we have as to what that will come out to. Instantaneous netting, a little complicated, but they're just kind of shrinking the net metering down. It used to be like on a monthly basis, and then it was on an hourly basis, and now they're trying to consider it down to nothing. And that just means that there'll be less benefit for owning solar. Then this next point is quite an interesting one. It's a retroactive penalty, I'll say. That's my opinion, but it's sort of true. So if you had for all the net metering 1 and 2 systems, you were grandfathered for 20 years. That is, if you were paying PG&E this amount for electricity, they'd pay you that same amount for the solar you're sending out there. So that rough parity, that was guaranteed for 20 years. And now this proposed decision would say, we're going to cut that by 25% to 15 years. So that's actually a big deal. You might say, well, that's not too bad. But you think about the people who got solar a while ago, that means that they are expecting to get maybe another 10 years out of it. Now they'll only get 5. So pretty soon they're going to get a whopper bill that they weren't expecting. So this is a rather long amount of time I spent on this slide, but there is so much more sausage making beyond there. The proposed decision is 200 pages, and the CPUC did what looks like a pretty impressive job of taking inputs from all those groups up above and putting it into this gigantic document about why they made the decisions that they made, as well as the ones that they did make. Okay, onward. So a couple of perspectives. This first perspective is the CPUC and PG&E and their allies. So these are the reasonings that they gave for the decisions that they made. And balancing the needs of electric grid, environment, consumers. That's just saying that because solar kind of got out of whack, they would say it was incentivizing wealthy people to get a fabulous investment, and the not so wealthy people were subsidizing them and so on. So they're trying to balance all these needs together and just kind of fix it up in a fairness sense. This next rooftop solar program robs from the poor and gives to the rich. That's from a Mercury News editorial. They're not known to be a right-wing hack job particularly, but that was their view of it. Editorial just after the decision came out. The CPC would say that the decision will help California decrease dependency on fossil fuels. That a lot of that has to do with the storage incentives. So right now, when the sun goes down, we don't have enough batteries, and so what we do is we fire up gas plants, which throw a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, and the industry throws a lot of methane into the atmosphere too. So they're fairly bad from a climate point of view. And so the CPUC is saying that we need to incentivize storage to handle this. And they would say that there's a social injustice, as I mentioned, what they'll call a cost shift argument. The cost is being shifted from solar owners to non-solar owners, they're saying. And so they're trying to repair that. And then they also say rooftop solar is not the best way to reach state energy goals. And the reason for that is because it's more expensive. They would say you can put a huge solar farm in the desert somewhere and do that much more cheaply than you can do the equivalent amount of solar on a bunch of solar roofs on rooftops. It's more expensive than you can expect. Instead of kind of whacking them out there one at a time, roof by roof by roof, each one is different. You can kind of get a bunch of people and spread them quickly out into the desert and so on. So that's the view of the CPUC and their allies. Another ally was, so one of the allies is TURN, Utility Reform Network. Another one was NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. So you kind of would not expect these outfits to be in favor of sort of corporate central traditional electricity and so on. So that's the thrust of it, is there's a lot of people on both sides. So my opinion is that the painting suggests my opinion of these things, but let me segment that out. So I'm screaming about this, and I'll get to that on the next slide. But all those things on the left, the text there, are suggestions, I think pretty legitimate approaches as to how the CPUC would say they made the decisions.
So
Okay.
Doug,
Yes.
we talked about taking some questions at this point, and I think that would be a good idea.
Sure, let me go
So
back.
let me just ask a couple of things. You've mentioned the California Public Utility Commission. Who basically does the CPUC answer to? Who's going to be the ultimate decision maker here?
Governor makes appointments, and an interesting facet here was that the prior president of the CPUC left, just kind of left really quickly late last year. And I don't know what went behind the scenes there, but Governor Newsom appointed a new president whose name is Alice Reynolds. And so they report to the governor in a sense that there can be back pressure by the governor onto the commissioners, and but they're independent once they're there, subject to being reappointed or not. So of course they have to follow California law, so the legislature is involved there. But I think the governor is kind of the point person, as being the person that appoints them.
Okay. The other governmental agency you haven't mentioned, of course, is federal tax laws. And that had been another big incentive with the investment tax credit. And still through 2022, there is a 26% tax credit. Question is whether or not that's going to come into play at all if these disincentives are activated. So.
Okay, well, yeah, and just to echo what you said, it's a tax credit. It's not a deduction, and so you don't have to itemize your deductions or whatever, so on. So it's actually a wonderful thing. It was 30% for many years, dropped to 26. A couple of years it'll drop to 22, and then it'll go away. And there's always speculation about whether or not the federal government may extend that or not. But that's certainly a big incentive. And I'm not quite sure what the question is. I don't think that'll get involved because it persists. I think that the net metering 3 decision will become implemented before the tax credit expires. It's even, and it doesn't go directly away. It goes from 26 to 22% at the end of next year. And so it's I don't think that'll be an impact into the net metering 3 decision.
But just to mention for people who are still in the stages of considering adding solar,
oh, totally, yeah,
that is still very much
an
incentive at this point.
It sure totally is, yeah. Excellent incentive.
Also just wanted to mention there's been a sort of stream in the chat about how long panels last. And I want to thank one of my Climate Action Committee members, Derek Holt, who's been answering some of these questions. As you mentioned, sort of average lifespan about 25 years. Sounds like manufacturers may say 30 to 35, but in practical life, 25 more an average or realistic estimate?
More, and it sort of can't be less because the warranted life is 25 years, and so if the warranties everything's complicated, a little bit prorated basically. But if you have trouble with a panel this side of 25 years, you can handle that via the warranty. But there's no real reason that they fall off a cliff there. I think it would be very difficult to build in planned obsolescence or something. It isn't like a complicated thing where that can be done with. And so they'll last, in some cases, much longer. There are plenty of panels, not only that are going after 40 years, but are still producing the manufacturer's nameplate output. So I think it's almost certain that you'll be able to go for years after 25, but basically all the financial modeling stuff goes with 25 because that's the warranted life.
And obviously they do degrade after that point, but still have usefulness. But
yeah.
There was a question about at the point that they really either are really not performing, or more likely that a customer would want to replace them with much more modern technology. What is being done with used solar panels?
That's a really good question. There's several questions in that one. One is, what's going wrong with the panels that you have? Things can break. It's pretty reliable. There are no moving parts. It usually lasts, but things can go wrong. And so if your installer is around and you're not getting the production you expect, call them up. if that installer is out of business or something, which does happen, then there are other outfits that will come and look at work that they didn't do. That's a growing business because solar's been around a while. Let's see, the new technology, it's certainly getting a little better. Panels are getting more efficient, meaning that you can get a little bit more energy out of a certain amount of square footage on your roof. But there's no real reason to get rid of your old panels unless you have limited unshaded roof space, and you got 2 new electric cars, and you have a huge new need and so on, and your old panels just aren't efficient enough. But they're getting a little bit more efficient. Certainly, they're in the low 20% now, and maybe a while back they were in the high teens percent. So they're a little bit better. But I think it would be, unless you have plenty of money to burn, it's not really a particularly good economic idea to throw out the old panels and put in the new ones. In terms of recycling, that's a pretty marginal business yet, and it's a really good question. But I think the way to look at it is there hasn't really been a need for any significant recycling, hardly at all, because if you consider panels that last 25 years, remember that curve that started up in the early 2000s, there was basically no solar being installed, a little bit here, a little bit there, but there's almost none. And it's now been about 15 years since then, 15 to 20 years since then. And so every one of those panels, or just about every one of those panels, is still going strong. So there's been a very small need to recycle panels to date. And there's nothing inherently unrecyclable about them. I mean, it's glass and aluminum, some silver and copper and this kind of thing. So they're probably 95% recyclable. And just like EV batteries are beginning, lots of technologies and companies are ramping up to be able to recycle all the materials in EV batteries. Same thing with solar panels. And so I think it's certainly something to keep an eye on and make sure people are doing the right thing, but that will be a good business, and there won't be anything like the kind of toxic waste that you see from decommissioned nuclear plants or fossil fuel emissions and so on.
I just want to comment that when I first started investigating solar in 2007, when I was president of the Association of Realtors, and there was a program in Berkeley called Solar First, and I had volunteered trying to be in a way, an advocate for solar to see if I could put it on my own roof. And at the time, I had a number of installers from the program come out and say, no, sorry, you don't have very good exposure, you don't have enough roof space, no, it's not going to work. Well, just about 15 years later, with microinverters and increased capacity, no problem, no problem. So, which ties into another question, which is, what about the microinverters? What is their lifespan?
Okay, I used to teach a lot of solar, and I would spend probably a good half hour on microinverters. So I'll see if I can cut that down by a factor of 20 or something. Let's see. So remember, audience, you have to turn that DC power, which the solar panels generate, into AC power, which goes out to the grid, and it makes your refrigerator would not be happy if you shipped it some DC power, and the grid would be very unhappy if you shipped it DC power. So the inverter has to make the electricity right. And so that can be done different ways. It used to be that you'd have one inverter for a solar system, and that's called a string inverter, maybe, or a central inverter. But then 10 years or a little bit over that, I guess, almost 15 years ago, some folks invented what they call microinverters, which is basically exactly the same thing. It's an inverter, only you have one of them per solar panel. You bolt it onto the solar panel instead of having one down on your garage wall or something. And so with a microinverter, the good part about that is if you have some shade during part of the day, then the single central inverter gets confused and can't figure that out very well, and that shade takes a big toll on your total system energy production. But if you have a bunch of microinverters, then the microinverter that's got the panel that's got shade just says, oh, I give up, but all the others are fine. And so you can have a much more shady roof where it's got morning shade or afternoon shade or partial shade or something, and you can get much more overall energy production out of that than if you had those panels with a single inverter. In terms of reliability, people were suspicious for a while because it gets really hot on the roof and electronics really hate heat. And so the microinverter company said, we're giving a 25-year guarantee, which is longer than the guarantee for the string inverters, interesting, which are usually 10 or 12 years. So they said, these things will last 25 years. We tested them, they will. And there were a few cases where some kinks needed to be worked out, but they basically do. They're pretty reliable. And so there aren't high failure rates at all. There have been millions and millions and millions of microinverters installed, and the failure rate is well known and it's pretty minimal and so on. So they're now the way to go. And I think it's a little more complicated than this, but I would say that microinverters are the dominant choice for inverters for most people, even if you don't have shading considerations. There are a lot of reasons for that I can go into, but I'll leave it at that they're a good product, they're tried and true, they'll last to 25 years, and they have better energy production features, especially if there's any kind of shading issues.
So two final things. One, we've had some questions about sort of basic systems. One person asked about, well, what size system for a 1,200 square foot house? And someone in the chat properly answered, it's really not so much about the size of the home, but really about consumption. And of course, what we would always urge is to first see where you can reduce your consumption through conservation and change of human behavior, assuming that you want to size your system as economically as possible. If money is no object, go for it. But is there some rule of thumb, say, for a household of 3 or 4 people? I think you mentioned the average system was about 5 kilowatts, and that was roughly $12,000 to $15,000.
I would say don't go on averages. I would say each is in particular. And a couple things are that it isn't so much about your current use, that's important. What are the future planned use? And so the way we get off of gas is not by going without hot water and going without furnaces and so on, but it's by electrifying those things. And so maybe we want to reduce energy consumption on sort of a general approach, but we basically want to shift lower gas consumption to higher electricity consumption. And the same with a gas pump. You know, electric car uses a huge amount of electricity, but it's an awful lot better on climate than a gasoline car. And so if you're planning in the next few years to switch out your gas cars for electric cars, you're going to probably want a lot more solar than would be appropriate for where you're at now. Or, you know, maybe if you got a kid moving out to go to college, you'll need less. Maybe the kid will come back home and use a lot of electricity. So every situation is different. And I think the thing to do is to be careful about that. The best way to do that is to get multiple bids. Anybody that wants to can always ask me stuff, and I'll give you lots of free advice if I can. But it comes down to who's the installer and what do they say and do they convince you and so on. And somebody, if you have plenty of roof space, you might be just fine with a 3 kilowatt system or less if you're maybe one person living a frugal life or something. And you might want a 10 kilowatt system if you've got a couple of electric cars and you're driving them a lot and you got electric heat, you got electric water, heat pump water heat or something like that. So I would say don't go with an average there. I mean, I think it's fine to say the average when you're taking all the systems and what's the average bill going to be at $8 a kilowatt. But I think for your own personal usage, I would definitely think more carefully about it on your own.
Well, and we certainly do want to encourage people to think as they're considering switching out a furnace system, don't just replace it with gas. Really consider heat pump technology, both for heating, which also provides air conditioning, and also for water heaters. Heat pump water heaters are brilliant. Induction cooktops are fabulous. Definitely not the old electric stove of anyone's past, but wonderful, clean, efficient, very fast systems. So as Doug said, really want to encourage people to think first about what is your future use and how you might be making smart changes.
Yes, and the smart change would be to go solar if you can. So we should probably spin through because I'm sensitive to it. We have to call it.
So that'll be the last question for now, and then we will get back to some more questions at the end.
Okay, great. Let me. So next slide. So I just gone over. This is what the PUC and PG&E consider as the reasons for doing what they did. Oops. And here's what the solar advocates do. And it may be a little bit of my opinion showing through, but all the rooftop solar advocates are pretty strongly against the CPUC decision. And And when NRDC, for example, is kind of for the, I think they're not looking at it very carefully. So there are large number of groups and a tremendous amount of individuals who've kind of yelled about this. So I didn't know quite how to phrase this. If I want to put it all kind of nice colors, but so that it's sort of interspersed red and green, and that's the way I got away with putting in a pretty picture to sort of to balance the scream on the last slide. But anyway, going through some of these, that's severe economic penalties for going solar. That's just not an overstatement at all. So $8 a month per kilowatt and 5 cents payment instead of the 25 and so on. Those are huge penalties. So is that really what we want? If we want to fix climate and we want a lot more solar and we want everybody to be using electricity instead of gas and so on, is the best way to do that to stick terrible penalties on solar? I don't think so. And when you do that, next bullet down, if you cripple solar economics, and it does that, then that hurts everyone. And so there's this messaging about how lower income people will be favored by this, but they can't afford it. They can't afford it because they'll be charged also. And there's some grace periods and some allowances and so on that sort of peter out after a few years. But when you impose harsh penalties for going solar, it hurts everyone across all income levels, and it kills the business. And there are a couple of surveys, one survey from a solar outfit, and so you might expect a little bias. They surveyed people and said, if we charge $8 a month per kilowatt, would you get solar? And 95% of the people said, no way. And another outfit, which is pretty esteemed in the energy biz, Wood McKenzie, of course they're esteemed because they're McKenzie, but Wood McKenzie is quite a well-known outfit. And they did an assessment and decided that if the proposed decision were implemented, it would cut solar installations by half by 2024. That's amazing. So remember that chart in the first couple of pages with that wonderful exponential growth going up there? Well, consider that cut in half. The growth would be cut in half. It would just flatline it. So it would really hurt it. So the third point down, PG&E, and this is a key factor. How does PG&E make money? How do they make their profit? And probably a lot of people are saying, well, I've got charged a huge amount for my energy bill this winter. And yeah, terrible, they gouged me. But actually, PG&E doesn't make their profit through sales of electricity or gas, which is kind of amazing. What happens is they build infrastructure, so long distance transmission lines and substations and so on. And the cost of those things they're rewarded for, they're given a guaranteed roughly 10% profit per year guaranteed. So the CPUC implements that. The way that they give them that profit is because PG&E has to pay to build transmission lines. So the way they get money for that, plus the profit, is via rates that we ratepayers pay, electricity and gas rates. Those rates are not based on how much electricity is used, but they're based on how much it costs to build infrastructure and reward PG&E to the tune of about 10% a year. And so why does PG&E prefer a centralized infrastructure with long distance transmission lines instead of rooftop solar? Well, they don't need to build those transmission lines anywhere near as much if there's a lot of rooftop solar. So rooftop solar cuts their profits, and that's why they like this approach. And that's maybe my opinion showing. I tried to say I'd be flat or distinguish when I was not, but that's pretty well known that PG&E makes money off of infrastructure build, and so they want to build infrastructure. That's kind of 1 + 1 = 2, I think. And so rooftop solar is counter to that. So that's why I don't like it. There's an argument about whether rooftop solar is or isn't one of the best ways to reach clean energy goals, and it's arguable, but I could certainly make a very good argument, take the rest of the session here saying why it's a really good way to do it. So I'll just say that it's a good case can be made that rooftop solar is the best, fast, and best and fast and cheapest way to fight climate. And I'll give it that as an assertion. There's some rejiggering about moving residential customers to instead of an annual true-up to do it monthly. And this is their wording, that it will result in unexpectedly large annual true-up bills. So CPUC kind of knows that people are going to be getting unexpectedly large bills. So they want to try and ease into that a little bit. And then the $8 a month I talked about, and so on. And the retroactive cut, that's the way they're cutting it for 20 years to 15. So those are perspectives on kind of the rooftop solar advocates. And then here's my assessment here. Now, say the top part of this, that's pretty straightforward. I don't think anybody would argue about that. I would just say the word volumetric. What a volumetric incentive means is when there's not very much solar out there, you give a whopper incentive. So lots of people say, wow, that's pretty cheap, I'll do that. But then there's a lot of solar out there and it's gotten a lot cheaper, then you give a smaller incentive. And so it means that the more volume of solar is out there, the less the incentive. And it's now dropped down to zero at the state level because we have so much solar. So it worked exactly the way it was supposed to, well designed. And California's taken a lot of initiatives, a lot of individuals have helped with this. And we've done many things that brought us to leadership. One of the points there, starting Jan 1, 2020, all new homes must have solar. And there's some exceptions, like if you don't have any unshaded roof and other kinds of exceptions. But basically the law says new homes must have solar electric systems on them. But now imagine if somebody's getting a solar electric system and 95% of people would not have solar if they had to pay $8 a month. What does that do to that law? People, what are people do? Are they going to like remove the solar once they move into a house because it costs them so much? Maybe they can't afford the grid access charge and so on. So there's craziness there that we have a new law mandating solar, and at the same time, we have this proposed decision that would really cripple the solar economics. Doesn't make sense. Then a little bit of my opinionating here. Causes the proposed decision retreat. There's this cost shift messaging that there's a lot of proponents, and these include people like Severin Bornstein from Berkeley Economics, UC Berkeley. So some fairly high-end people that will argue this case. The people that don't have solar are subsidizing people who do. And when you add to that the people who do have solar tend to be on the more affluent side, then it's poor people subsidizing rich people. Remember the San Jose Mercury article that said they're stealing from the poor to give to the rich? That has been very successful messaging. It's quite misleading. I think it's dead wrong, but that messaging has been really successful. And so it's brought a lot of people on board, like environmental justice people, social justice people that are thinking, wow, that should never happen. We should never subsidize rich people by gouging poor people. So that messaging worked, even if it's wrong. Everything's really complicated. Like I've talked to a lot of people about their bills. If you looked at your PG&E bill, I'll just bet you dollars to donuts that half of it is completely opaque and indecipherable. Nobody understands the PG&E bill. It's ridiculously complicated, so nobody can really get to the bottom of anything. This third point down there, IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, they're the PG&E union. So when the long distance transmission lines are built, the IBEW builds them. And so they are all in favor of PG&E's approach to keeping the centralized electricity system going. And they're unions, so if you were to say, are unions good? Then a lot of the country would say, hell yeah. But in this case, IBEW is against rooftop solar. So that makes it very complicated messaging. CPUC has a very close relationship with PG&E. They've been nailed many times in the past with colluding, I guess there's that word, and so on in the past. And PG&E is not a good corporate citizen. They're a convicted felon. They've been convicted of felonies both on the gas and electricity side. They've gone bankrupt a couple of times and so on. So it's kind of some bad news in there. And then there were petitions and calls and emails. There are 100,000 calls made to Governor Newsom's office. Don't let this go through and so on. And it was hugely in favor of rooftop solar, hugely against the CPUC's proposed decision. And so there was no way that such a niche decision was supported by so few people who get through, except for that close relationship. So there's something going on there that's not right, obviously. Okay, onward. So timeline, the proposed decision was December 13th. Whoops, sorry. Lots of petitions and calls and emails. And then on January 11th, Newsom made this hint, more work needs to be done. That means that the proposed decision was kind of put into abeyance and they'd think about it a little later. The final decision was to be made on January 27th, but he said, more work's to be done. He also said, yeah, but he doesn't want to get in the way of the CPUC decision-making process. So which is it, Governor? And I think what it is he's hinting, and it's a public hint, and that's the pressure that he can put on them. He doesn't want to sort of provide undue pressure to them, but on the other hand, that's exactly what he's doing. And so the reason that the vote was postponed, this formal reason, was that the new president says he wanted all the commissioners seated. There's one guy, his name is also Reynolds, but not related, who hasn't been seated yet. That's sort of the formal, easy reason, but obviously pressure on Newsom caused him to put some pressure on the CPUC. So my guess is, a wild ass guess is at least 3 months till the final decision. I think it'll take a while. And the decision will be, well, do we tune up the proposed decision, or do we throw it out and start again? Who knows? Could be a little sooner than that. If they just tune it up, that would be bad news. But I think there's enough going on that it might take a while. And then the implementation date. So if the final decision is made, say, in May, then probably the implementation date will be 4 months after that. So maybe August or something. So it's pushed out a ways. This will be really good news to a lot of people that had not been able to get their solar installed before May, because the solar installers have backlogs because enough people realize they need to get moving on it or they'll lose their chance to go see solar with good economics. So this will give them a few more months. Just guesses, though we don't know yet. Then, Arlene, shall I keep going?
Yeah,
Instead of pausing?
there are a few questions, but
Okay.
did you have additional comments?
Well, I think the next 4 slides won't take too long, maybe 15
Well, why don't
minutes.
you continue then, and then we'll take all the questions at the end.
Okay, good.
And it sounded for a while like we've been having a funny buzzing sound. I've made sure everyone's been muted, but it seemed to be coming on and off with your mic. But for the moment, it's gone. So let's just keep going and keep our fingers crossed.
Okay, that sounds worthwhile. I'll just do that. Okay, so 4 more slides, basically. So what do we do now? And what do we do now? What do we do soon? What do we do to kind of keep faith going? And what's the vision? So what do we do now? The pressure clearly had an effect, even though it wasn't quite as strong as we might hope. So the decision was delayed, and so we got to keep telling Newsom what to do. We're not sure where he stands. We don't know what phone calls he's making to whom and what he's saying or anything, but we need to make it clear to him what we want. And so I summarized that. We want forward-looking, decentralized, et cetera. But if you don't really know what to tell him, and everything is very complicated. There are a lot of organizations that are very passionate about this. And so I'm not sure how the best way to get out is, but you can always write to me and I'll send you organizations and people, and lots of them have example, like with any initiative, lots of people have example letters, or example things to say to Newsom. Hello, Governor Newsom, I'm a California resident, blah, blah, blah. And they'll put the words in your mouth if you like, or you could tune them up, or you could say anything you want. But I think more is better. So somewhere those 100,000 calls, over 100,000 calls, made a difference. And so let's keep doing that, because whether they tweak the proposed decision or shelve it, we have no idea, which is more likely. We don't know that. So everything you can do helps. And, as they say, nothing ever gets done except by a small group of people. Well, if you have a lot of small groups of people, then more power. So what do we do soon? Well, say the decision comes down, it's not very good. I would predict it will not be a very good decision, but we don't know. Well, it turns out there's a precedent that Nevada railroaded their solar customers. They took away the grandfathering there, and they cut it to pieces. And there was a huge backlash. I think this was 2015 or so. I might be off by a few years. Oh, 2016 maybe. And so a lot of pressure, huge public backlash all over the place. And so the governor threatened some of his PUC commissioners, Governor Sandoval, and threatened one of them that he would not reappoint him, and other kinds of words happened. And so ultimately a unanimous vote of the PUC reversed that decision. And so Nevada went back to legitimizing rooftop solar. So there's a precedent that can happen. So we need to start a targeted effort to reverse NEM3 if it comes down as a decision we don't like. And so that'll take all kinds of things, but last resort, we have a California proposition, and there's a huge amount of support for solar. Support for solar crosses political boundaries. Conservatives think of it as freedom, and they think of it as understanding the electricity costs and keeping electricity costs down. Progressive like it for climate reasons and so on. There's really no one that doesn't like solar, with the exception of the entrenched businesses that it threatens directly. So solar is very popular. In fact, that's true across the country. It's amazing. There's almost nothing that has as much support as solar, I would say, across the country, across all spectrum of the political spectrum. So let's go for a proposition. We need to do that, and don't let solar go dark. And in the meantime, how do we keep the faith? Well, what will happen if solar economics go into the trash bucket? Well, that doesn't mean that rooftop solar has to be invalidated. And so what lots of people are suggesting is possibly viable is you put some solar on your roof and you put some batteries somewhere and you keep those detached from the grid. That doesn't mean that you go off grid. You don't take your home off grid. It's just you have the on-grid part of your home that's connected to PG&E is on a separate circuits from your solar and your battery. And this gets kind of very technical stuff going on, but it's eminently possible to do that. And for example, if you have an EV, you could have panels on your garage and a battery in the garage and an EV in the garage, and you could keep that EV going just fine without having anything to do with PG&E. You will not incur those penalties of dollars, $8 per kilowatt per month and so on. And you get almost nothing if you send the electricity to PG&E anyway. So if you don't send the electricity to PG&E, but instead use it to charge your car, it's just sort of a separate system. And that's okay if you've got an EV and so on. But there's another cool thing. This DCBEL.energy company, they just announced this product and they're taking reservations for it, and they expect to ship it this spring, I think. And maybe it'll delay a little bit, but they may. And so that's an interesting device, and much too complicated for this talk here. But basically what it allows you to do is to power your house from your car. You might have heard of something like that because the Ford electric truck, their F-150 pickup truck, also does this. And it's complicated, but they partner with a company to do all the electronics, and there are quite a few electronics and electrical switching and so on to do that. But basically, if the grid goes down, what do you do? How do I keep my fridge going? Well, you can use your electric car to power your fridge. And as it says here, electric cars have big batteries. One GM Chevy Bolt, the battery is larger than 4 Tesla Powerwalls. It's a huge battery compared to a thing that you bolt on your garage. So this is a pretty good interim solution. I would expect this nowhere near in the quantities that the net metering 2 rooftop solar would do, because the economics will not be very good here, but they'll be good, and they'll give you that benefit of having a power outage protection. So this will be happening. If worst case, PG&E really messes with us and the CPUC doesn't fix it, worst case, this sort of solution will be proliferating, even if nowhere near as fast as if we didn't crush solar economics for grid tie. Then lastly, what's our vision for the future? And this picture down there that's got microgrid on it, that's the same picture. It's got the solar and the battery and the EV. And so you can call that a microgrid. It's not really much of a microgrid if it's just your garage. And the idea with that switch there is that the microgrid sort of comes on as soon as the power goes off. And then, but if you consider that you're one house in a neighborhood of 100 or 1,000 houses, a microgrid is something that can be built up from those 100 or 1,000 neighborly houses, not if they're all off grid, if we need to do in the near future, but over time, when they figure out that microgrids are a pretty cool thing, and it's much too complicated for this talk, but microgrids are a very cool thing. More resilient, cheaper, cleaner, better in lots of ways, much more protected against physical attack and cyber hacks and so on. Like a guy with a rifle can go take out enough PG&E towers to knock out a city. A team of people with a few sniper rifles could do that easily, but no way with a microgrid. So there are all kinds of ways that microgrids are in our future. It's just we don't know quite when we'll get there. But if we all build our solar panels and we put our batteries and our electric cars together, then we've potentiated microgrids, which when at such point in the future we're going to get our heads screwed on back on correctly and decide that we want to put solar, we want to maximize solar on roofs everywhere and have a better energy system, and that will look like that. And that's it. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Doug. So there's been a thread in the chat about how to most effectively lobby for the changes that we hope we could get into this recommendation. I want to particularly thank Robert Kennedy, who has had some experience, it sounds like, in lobbying, reiterating the fact that the personal letter, maybe now more than ever, really works. Anyone can just Google Governor Newsom's address and get his address in Sacramento. I've put his phone number in the chat. That might get 10 points versus 100, but it took about 10 minutes. I've done it twice now. Put in a phone call, made my pitch of I'm a voter in the state of California, and I'm a rooftop solar owner or not, and I feel strongly against the CPUC's recommendation. It's worth 10 minutes of your time. You can multitask. Let's see, there were also questions about perhaps why we here locally in Berkeley, Oakland area, have a community energy group that has not been particularly active. Doug, do you have any sense of what their role? Are they really tied directly with PG&E? Or should we expect more from them in terms of lobbying for a better system?
It's very complicated. Let me tease it a little bit. There's an amazing history. These are called community choice aggregation systems, also known as community choice energy. People in Alameda County mostly are on East Bay Community Energy. People in Contra Costa and other places are on Marin Clean Energy. And there are quite a few of them in the state, and they're booming. But there's a guy who was a graduate school in philosophy in the 80s, and he said, wow, democracy's not doing very well. How can we fix it? And so he went from being a graduate student, he said, I think the best way to fix democracy is to fix energy democracy. And so a graduate student decided to write a bunch of laws, and he got the laws written and passed. His name's Paul Fenn, and nobody's ever heard of him. So Paul Fenn created the concept of community choice aggregation, and he's a good guy, and the community choice aggregation programs are the good people. But it's incredibly complicated. They don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of resources, they have a lot of legislative breadth, but they tend to follow in PG&E's footsteps in terms of the rate plans and so on. And so I'm not sure what to say, except in my opinion, the community choice aggregation programs, those are great places to put your hope. They're locally controlled, county-based organizations, nonprofit organizations that you can have a voice in. And so they're the place to go if you want to determine your energy future. And it's incredibly complicated how their relationship with PG&E goes and so on. And lots of things are difficult, but I would say don't give up hope on the CCAs.
Is there, well, I'm just wondering if there's any hope of a change in the structure of PG&E. You know, you explained, I thought, rather well, just in quick terms, how they're making their money. Is that baked into the law? Is that entrenched? Is there any hope of changing that structure?
I think everything's on the table. The problem is there's a lot of people that feel that if the state were to say take over PG&E, that it would turn into a boondoggle, and then they would cite the DMV and they would cite high-speed rail and so on. But there is a proposal, I believe it's called Golden State Energy, which is the California, that would be the proposal for California to take over at least PG&E. Maybe they call them the IOUs. That means investor-owned utilities. So, and there are three big ones in California, PG&E and two others. And so I think Golden State Energy would take over all three of them. I'm not sure about that. It might just be PG&E, which is sort of the worst corporate citizen in terms of felonies and bankruptcies. But I guess the question is, what is the alternative, and how do we get there from here? Really, not very many people like PG&E very much, and so they've done a lot of bad things. And so, what do we do?
Starting some fires.
Yeah, yes, they've been convicted of multiple of involuntary 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter for Paradise. I mean, that's pretty bad. And they blew up people in San Bruno with gas. So they've been convicted of felonies on both the gas side and the electric side. But the question is, what's the vision for accomplishing something? And I think the CCAs, I would say they're not bad, but they have not really gone very far towards a vision of what really is possible and should be done.
Right. I mean, we've been talking about PG&E, of course, because that's our local provider here in the area of the Hillside Club. But in fact, the CPUC impacts all of the public utilities in the state of California. It's not just PG&E, to answer a question in the chat. So
I should add in that the CCA programs, by the way, are responsible for generating energy, and PG&E is responsible for transmitting energy. So on your PG&E bill, you'll see some charges. You'll see the gas and electric side, but you'll also see the charges for generation and transmission. That's what you pay PG&E. You pay on the PG&E bill, but some of that money, and it'll be noted on the bill in complicated ways, some of that money goes to EBCE or MCE, and that's because they're responsible for generating electricity. That's the main distinction.
And there was also a question about, we are in fact already, those of us who have solar, we are paying a connection fee. But as you said, it's very complicated. I don't know how many of you have tried to take a look and really understand your energy bill. Lord. But roughly now, what is it compared to the current proposal?
Let's see. So we pay, each solar owner pays about $10 a month. That's called the minimum charge. And that's intended to take care of the grid. The argument that PG&E had, and there's certainly, it's not completely a fabrication, would be that the grid costs more than that. And so instead of $10 a month, what they're saying is we'll charge you for that average system. We'll charge you $8 times 5 kilowatt, $40 a month, and we'll also pay you almost nothing for the electricity you export.
Well, in fact, and one proposal said $48 and up. And
that'd be for six.
That's sort of understated, yeah.
If your average is 6 kilowatts, then that's how they use that, yeah.
Right. Okay. Let's see. Why don't you just make sure we get to any other of the major questions? I think let's see. There are questions about battery storage, about whether or not they make sense for small systems. I mean, there is, of course, the whole issue now. Doug explained how the cost of rooftop solar really hit a sweet spot. I mean, it went down per kilowatt, it got more effective and cheaper, where battery backup has not really hit that sweet spot in the same way.
Everything is so complicated. You know, the supply chain shortage, which is hitting the entire world, is part of that. And electric cars they're still not a huge percentage of car sales, but they're growing rapidly. And so they have these huge batteries. And so where do you want to put your lithium? You put it into an electric car or into somebody's battery on their home. And so the electric car is where a lot of the battery power goes. And batteries are expensive and they're complicated, dual permits. There's a lot of permitting issues. So the people that used to be able to install solar can't install batteries the same way. There's some contractor laws and so on. So it's very complicated. But I think also people are sort of expecting the price to come down because as EVs flourish, the idea is that demand will produce innovations that will lower the price. And some people will suggest that $100 a kilowatt hour is a big threshold after which EVs will sort of ramp them up. So there are a lot of different factors. But really, if you were to, just one more thing is that there's now probably, if you were to try and get a battery, you'd be put into a line and have to wait months and months and months and months to do it.
And again, not wanting to get in the weeds because the phrase that Doug's used all evening, it's complicated, is really true, is that there are differing kinds of technology of batteries, not all of which are the best suited for, say, self-arbitrage using your battery to power your house at night. And a major brand, naming no brands that start with a T, are perhaps not the best technology for that, and other systems are. And there are a lot of new batteries coming down the pipe, just a lot of new electric vehicles. So it's complicated. I hope that our audience has at least gotten your curiosity stimulated to find some answers that are specific to your situation. I'll apologize for not giving Doug all of the questions in the chat, but we will be saving the chat. He has generously offered to answer questions, one that I didn't have him answer, but I will happily offline, and probably he would too, which is recommendations for reputable solar installers. It's really not our place here, but offline we will be happy to share our prejudices. So mostly I would just say go local. Go local, and someone who has withstood the test of time. Doug alluded to the fact that not all solar companies have survived. For the event that when we first met in 2016, I had 8 solar companies that were supposed to be joining us that day. One of them filed bankruptcy that day, so we only had 7. And after that, 4 of the 7 are no longer with us.
Wow.
And 1 has gone out of the solar business primarily. That's not a good track record. So
let me add one thing, if I may, which is really counterintuitive. It's sort of embarrassing. I give this advice. I would suggest, instead of looking for the best solar installer, you look for one that can get it done in time. Now, I've got some more time, but do not wait. Maybe will slip through, but I don't think so. I would say do not wait until NEM 3 comes around. If you can get somebody that's decent and licensed, they have to be licensed. But if you get somebody that's decent, that's preferable to the top-notch guy that can't get it done until August.
And absolutely get it done this year, folks. Absolutely. Take advantage of the investment tax credit. So on that note, we have passed our 8:30 witching hour. I very much want to thank you, Doug. This has been very, very informative.
No, thank you. Pleasure.
And you're awfully good at being as neutral as you possibly could.
I'm not sure I leaped that bar too high, but thank you.
But I appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to just mention briefly, we do these fireside meetings on the first Monday of many months. There will be a session 1 month from tonight in March. I don't have all of the details confirmed, but we will be talking on a topic that actually is about rocket science. So we are hoping to feature a NASA scientist, and that would be very exciting to hear what it's like to be an engineer working for NASA these days. And then in April, please put on your calendars, April 7th, I believe it is, the first Monday of April. We're very fortunate. I've been working for months now to finalize Victoria Kastner. She's a truly brilliant art historian, who will be premiering her upcoming book on the private life of Julia Morgan. We hope very much that by April we will be back in our beautiful clubhouse and you can join us here. If not, she is prepared to make arrangements to sign her books virtually and mail them to you, but we hope she'll be able to be with us.
April 4th is the first Monday in April.
Thank you, David. So April 4th, 4/4.